You're most welcome to a webinar, which is has a twofold identity. Let me first repeat the topic we have today. Our topic is Liberatory Philosophy and Politics in the Time of Civilizational Crisis. This is the first leg of the research seminar at the University of Helsinki called the von Wright and Wittgenstein Research Seminar. It's directed by me. I'm Thomas Wallgren in my native Finnish, Swedish, professor of philosophy here in Helsinki. So that's how we begin the spring term. But I'm also very happy and proud that this event is also one part of the World Social Forum, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this week. It coincides with 10 years anniversary of the Arab Spring uprising. So those are political events to remember. So this event has this double function. I'm very pleased to have with me here today Rupert Read, professor of philosophy at the University of East Anglia and fellow activist from the environment and democracy movement, known from the last years, I think, as an activist, especially from Extinction Rebellion and work there, but you have a long time presence in work on environment, democracy, global responsibility, as well, of course, as a scholar, especially in Wittgenstein studies, but with a broad range. So this is Rupert, and you will be our speaker. We have with us two panelists. We have Anat Matar from Tel Aviv, a philosophy colleague who has worked a lot on Wittgenstein as well. But Anat is also known and also present here because of your role as an activist for dialogue, peace, and democracy in the Middle East, and why not globally. So welcome, Anat. I'm very happy that you could join us.
Hello, thank you for inviting.
Thank you. Good to see you here, Anat. And Aseem, Shrivastava, we met in Tunis at the World Social Forum, I think in 2014, is that right? 15, okay. Yeah. And since then we've been in touch over issues of building ecological democracy globally. Aseem is based in Delhi, is that right? Mm-hmm. And a writer, lecturer, author on burning issues of our times, especially relating to the civilizational crisis and ecology. Very happy to have you here. Aseem, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Rupert, the floor is yours.
Well, Thomas, thank you so much. Thanks to all the fellow panelists just introduced. It's splendid to be among such distinguished friends and colleagues. Thanks to everyone who's come here today for this Wittgenstein and von Wright event, which is also a World Social Forum event. And that way of describing the event already summarizes part of what we had in mind when we started to create this afternoon's event, Thomas and I. We wanted to bring together these two worlds, these two topics, which are the topics of two of my most recent books. And that was the immediate prompt for the event. So on the one hand, I have a book just out called Wittgenstein's Liberatory Philosophy, about obviously Wittgenstein and philosophy. But the term liberatory in the title perhaps already gives you a hint that this book is intended to have a kind of ethical or political purport. And in that way, it points, as it were, toward the other book, this little book, which I published a couple of years ago, This Civilization is Finished, a dramatic title, which I will explain in the course of my remarks. So we're bringing together the world of philosophy and the world of Wittgenstein with the world of activism, the world of the World Social Forum, the world where the world is not just everything that is the case, but everything that might be about to come to an end. And let's see if we can together think about that and maybe even start to do something which will make that ending less likely. So I've already started to hint how these two books are linked. Let me now make a more concrete remark about how they're linked. They're both based in a kind of critique of progress, a critique that I take myself to share very deeply with Wittgenstein, also to some extent with von Wright, and to share to differing extents with my fellow panelists here today. We'll see exactly where everybody lines up on this, but if I were to give a very kind of crude first approximation of a guess, I would say that Aseem's critique of progress is, if anything, even more fundamental, or some would say extreme, than my own. Thomas's may be slightly less so than my own, and Anat's may be slightly less so again. So I think we're all close to each other, but we're perhaps on a, this is all very crude, obviously, but we're perhaps on a bit of a spectrum with some differences in terms of how we would see the interrogation of progress, how deeply we would see that needing to go. But as I say, I take myself certainly to be very much aligned with Wittgenstein in this deep critique of progress. And that alignment was the basis, in part, for Wittgenstein's liberatory philosophy, and in part for This Civilization is Finished, which opens with a discussion which explicitly touches on Wittgenstein's philosophy. So let me, as promised, explain the titles of these two books to those of you who've not had a chance to read them. We'll start with Wittgenstein's liberatory philosophy. What is liberatory philosophy? How is it present in Wittgenstein? So I see Wittgenstein as, in a certain sense, above all, seeking to free us up from pictures that hold us captive. So far, so unoriginal. Wittgenstein explicitly says that himself. Of course, that's part of the basis of my book. One of the main things that my book is it works through some of the key moments in Wittgenstein's great masterpieces, later work, his philosophical investigations, and suggests how those can be made best sense of according to a picture of them as being primarily liberatory in intent. And to expand on that idea of liberation a little more, it's about not being held captive by pictures, by ideologies. In the conclusion of the book, I explicitly extend this consideration to ideologies. It's about being able to find a space of freedom in which you can move and think and decide which linguistic pictures you wish to use, because we're not talking here about a complete abandonment of language or thought or something like that. We're talking about being a master, as it were, of the language that you use, rather than being mastered by it. And in particular, and here obviously we more explicitly enter into a realm of politics, against the tyranny of concepts like progress, which does, I strongly believe, still tyrannize our time, and stop us from thinking clearly, and stop us from being able to see the horrific damage we're doing to our world and to ourselves. And here, of course, is one of the places where it gets fun and interesting, against the tyranny of freedom itself, or the idea of liberty, which I argue explicitly in the book is an idea that itself holds us captive at this time. In, for example, such well-known fantasies as the American Dream, which is a fantasy of freedom. And what I argue in the book is that the one thing that cultures such as, if they are cultures at all, such as the US and UK, and increasingly, of course, global culture, so-called, the one thing which they really promise, freedom, even that they don't deliver, because they don't deliver the possibility of genuine freedom of thought. And instead, they're giant forms of conformism, including through the way in which they seek to enforce a kind of fantasy of freedom that you find, for example, in consumer choice upon us all. So that is the idea of liberatory philosophy, that we can be free of all of this, including free of the tyranny of the concept of freedom itself. And that is what I seek to demonstrate in the course of that book. Now, moving to This Civilization is Finished, what does that dramatic title mean? Well, I can illustrate that by mentioning to you the names of 3 animals. And those names are butterfly, phoenix. Okay, phoenix is a mythical animal, but never mind that for now. And dodo. I suggest in This Civilization is Finished that there are 3 possibilities facing us, 3 possibilities facing our civilization. The first and most attractive possibility is the one I'm labeling butterfly. That is that we succeed in the coming years in rapidly repurposing our civilization, transforming it into something that can last. This civilization will then turn into something so different from itself that it will be as different as a butterfly is from a caterpillar. And a caterpillar, by the way, is quite a good analogy for our civilization, because a caterpillar, of course, unheedingly chomps everything before it and turns it into waste. And if left unchecked, caterpillars will destroy their local ecosystem. And that, of course, is what we are doing, only not so locally. So we need to move from being caterpillars through perhaps a difficult stage of pupa to being butterflies. This is what everybody who I give this kind of talk to wants to do. I must tell you, however, and I argue this explicitly in the book, that it's going to be very, very difficult now to bring about this kind of transformation. We have left it so incredibly late. It's not 5 minutes to midnight. It's 5 minutes past midnight, or maybe 10 minutes past midnight. If we manage to transform, there will still be a lot of pain along the way. And one of the concepts we need here, which I develop across my work these days, is the concept of transformative adaptation. Because we're not going to be able to change now without adapting to the climatic damage and ecosystem damage which has already been caused and is already built in to the coming years. So that's the possibility of butterfly. Let's see if we can pull it off. The second possibility, which I argue is much more likely, is the possibility of phoenix. And what this means is that our civilization is likely to collapse, but that a new civilization may emerge from the ashes. So phoenix. And this is a lot better than the third possibility, dodo, which is, I take it, fairly obvious to you what that one means. Our civilization collapses and nothing rises from the ashes. So phoenix is a lot more attractive than dodo. Butterfly is a lot more attractive than phoenix, but my argument is that butterfly is also, unfortunately, at this point, less likely than phoenix. So we need to pursue 2 strategies simultaneously. We need to seek to transform, including transformationally adapting, but we also need to deeply adapt, in other words, to ready ourselves for the possibility, which I think is a probability, that there will be a collapse, and try to ensure that that collapse isn't terminal. Luckily, I believe that there is a huge overlap between what I've called transformative adaptation and deep adaptation. So there's plenty to do there which fulfills these 2 goals simultaneously. My argument would be bringing together these 2 worlds, the world of the World Social Forum and the world of philosophy, the world of This Civilization is Finished and the world of Wittgenstein's liberatory philosophy. My argument would be that when we find freedom, we will choose ecology. And that's what makes it hopeful that we might even yet be able to take the path of transformation, the butterfly path. My argument would be that this is the case for various reasons, but included among those reasons is simply that we will see that there is no other intelligent or wise choice available, no other way that things can last. And this is the true meaning of the title, This Civilization is Finished, to come back explicitly to that. Even the butterfly possibility means that this civilization is over, because if we succeed in effecting the transformation I have in mind, we will be butterflies. We will look very little like the caterpillars that we currently look like. So one way or another, this civilization is finished. If people try to prolong it longer, that only makes it less likely that we will succeed in transforming. An analogy here would be thinking of those cartoon characters which are off the cliff, and they're pumping their legs furiously in the air. We need to get back somehow to the edge of the cliff, or to vary the analogy slightly, to climb up the cliff that we've already fallen halfway down. It's going to be very, very difficult, but it is still, I believe, possible. And now my final remark before we go over to the discussants. What I also argue in Wittgenstein's liberatory philosophy is that the space of freedom that we can clear, and that Wittgenstein helps us to clear, the space of autonomy, to use the word that Immanuel Kant first taught us in philosophy. And I regard Wittgenstein as a kind of inheritor of Kant, who changes everything or overturns everything in Kant, a bit like Marx and Hegel, except that the initial ideal of autonomy is still preserved. But that idea is itself deeply radicalized, because I argue in Wittgenstein's liberatory philosophy that autonomy is relationality. That if we understand correctly what it means to be free, freedom of thought and freedom of action, we understand that it means freely choosing being with others in a natural setting. That there is no freedom without regarding other people as essentially enabling you rather than essentially constraining you. And here, of course, is where somebody like John Rawls, I think, is so hopelessly inadequate and a catastrophic vision of what freedom would be, because Rawls essentially thinks of other people as constraints upon oneself rather than as essentially part of what it could possibly mean for one to be free. So autonomy is relationality. Our civilization of separation is finished. The sooner we realize that, the more chance we have of being butterflies rather than dodos. Thanks for listening, Thomas.
Thank you, Rupert. Thank you so much. And congratulations and thank you for your splendid books. Two of them, one short dialogic, This Civilization is Finished, and the other one, more classical academic book, but with very many non-classical ingredients, at least for Wittgenstein scholarship. Those are amazing books, Rupert. I'm very happy and proud to be able to announce them here. Most people who attend will not have had the opportunity to read them yet, so I'm very glad that you could succinctly point out some major themes there. I would ask Aseem to go first as among the commentators. I will invite Anat, and I will also be very happy to have a few points of my own at the end of the panel, and then give back to you, Rupert. Is that fine for you?
Yes, great.
Aseem and Anat, are you happy with that? Very good. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Thomas. How much time can I speak? 5 minutes or 10 minutes?
You can use up to 10 minutes because Rupert was so brief.
That's what I was embarrassed about, because I don't want to exceed Rupert's time, and I don't want to colonize Anat's time.
No, we're excited to have you here, Aseem. It will be interesting,
Okay.
At least for me.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank all of you for having me here, and it's very refreshing to be able to speak about philosophy and politics in the same evening, or in the same breath even, as Rupert is bravely attempting, and as I would rarely dare to. I just avoid politics sometimes and prefer the comforts of philosophy. I don't think of it as consolation, I think of it as comfort. There are many things to say about what Rupert so briefly but provocatively has flagged. But I'm going to focus on just a few things and then hope that other matters will come up through Anat's presentation and in the discussion. And if not, then I'll bring them up at that stage. I'm going to try to be as provocative as I can myself, so as to get us to think together rather than separately, in line with what Rupert was just saying about coming together rather than remaining in an alienated condition. it's quite obvious, even to Donald Trump, I think, that we are living in caterpillar civilization. And this is a stillborn caterpillar, or some sort of, shall we say, an atavistic dodo, which is incubating in this stillborn caterpillar. So I'm sort of mixing up metaphors here, or rather adapting Rupert's metaphor to describe the vacant, vacuous, nihilist absurdity of our times. I think, given that, even the alt-right or the fake news artists are convinced that this is a caterpillar civilization. They just identify evil consistently outside themselves rather than partake of their share of the responsibility for it. I think we are on a pretty good wicket, actually, and a much better wicket than the so-called left would care to admit. So that's the first observation, that I think it's kind of exciting, actually, to know that even those who claim to know and run the system are actually at their wits' end as to where to go next, except to the moon or Mars or some other fantasy that soothes the imagination of the followers of Elon Musk and their likes. The second observation I have is that, let's be blunt, there are people who come from conquering cultures, and there are people who come from conquered cultures. And some of us get stuck somewhere in between, in some middle discomfort zone between the conquerors and the conquered. If we acknowledge that, then I think one has to ask a very simple, far too simple question, perhaps even for the great Immanuel Kant, which is to say, what on earth is freedom? Do we really know what freedom is? Did Kant really know what freedom was? I'm not trying to be insulting of a great mind. I'm only trying to ask a very simple sub-question to that, which is the following. If we think of freedom, human freedom that is, as something which is only obtainable through the conquest of nature, I'm afraid we've got it wrong. And I'm afraid most of the Enlightenment project, with all due respect to the great minds, but most of the Enlightenment project, Kant, Hegel, Marx, they follow that line of thought. In other words, Francis Bacon upgraded and updated. And if you look at the second edition of the preface to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, you might recall that Kant actually applauds Francis Bacon explicitly there and says that if he hadn't shown us the way, and if he hadn't established the empiricist scientific method, we would still be rolling around in the dark of the centuries. And he gives examples from Galileo and the inclined plane and so on. So that's a pretty serious misconception. The evidence of the last 2 centuries has demonstrated that. Yes, John Dewey applauds, I mean, there's hardly anybody, all the way to the great Marxist historian E.P. Thompson applauds Francis Bacon, Marx and Grundrisse and other places. So Francis Bacon is sort of the unquestioned patron saint and the first sort of author of modern progress, the first author of the definition. He's the one who gives the first definition of modern progress. I'm saying this also because over the last 2 months, while I've been working on my own book on Rabindranath Tagore, modernity and ecosophy, I've had a chance to look at Bacon's writings extensively. And it is horrifying to realize the sort of things that he says about the natural world. And we can go into it some other time. But that is the lineage of the famed Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is the lineage of today's technocracy. You cannot ignore this. This is central to the discussion that we are having. So the question I have here is, do we really understand what freedom means? Who was the last person in Western modernity to actually feel and experience freedom? When Rabindranath Tagore goes to America for the first time, I think it's in 1916, And he's standing before a president. I think it's Woodrow Wilson it would be at that time, or maybe Teddy Roosevelt, I'm not sure. He says the concept of freedom that Western civilization today has is utterly superficial and materialistic. Remember, this is 105 years ago. He's identifying it. This is exactly 7 years after Mahatma Gandhi has published Hind Swaraj, in which he says explicitly that this is a 9 days wonder, talking about modern civilization, not so much Western civilization. Now, my own crude amateur historian understanding of the West is that Western civilization is actually long over. Western civilization died between 1914 and 1918 because the way Europe savaged itself, it could not survive that. And then whatever was left was demolished by Hitler and the Holocaust. I mean, how can you recover from the savagery of these two great wars, right? None of this was not predictable, right? All the way since Kierkegaard and Baudelaire and Nietzsche, any number of philosophers, prophets, and seers in Europe, Simone Weil, had foreseen these wars coming. John Maynard Keynes himself, the great economist, possibly the greatest economist of the last 100 years, himself says at the end of World War I that, look, you are treating Germans in such a way that there's bound to be a backlash and they're bound to come back at us. I mean, that's the Treaty of Versailles. So all of that was predictable. And if you read the poets, writers, and philosophers of the 1920s in Europe, Paul Valéry, Oswald Spengler, Wittgenstein, needless to say, and a ton of others, they're all quite clear. Western civilization as they remember it, as their parents and ancestors bore it, is gone. There will never be another Johann Sebastian Bach, not in this land. That became clear by the 1920s itself. So what are we living in for the last 100 years is the question. And I think where we are living now is not only the American aftermath, but the aftermath of the American aftermath is upon us, which is to say, it's a bleeding giant. It's a matter of time before that empire collapses, as Rupert has rightly identified in saying this civilization is finished. So the question I have for you, Rupert, and this is related to the observation I'm making about freedom, what is the bag of habits that need to be offloaded or left behind or surrendered when we say this civilization is finished and you want to maximize the chances of the butterfly and minimize the chances of the dodo and the, possibly phoenix as a transitory thing? What is the bag of habits which we have to ask to be set aside? And I can tell you in one word, my answer to that would be the will to power has to be surrendered. Without the surrender of the will to power, there'll always be a competitive drive for conquest across the earth. The Americans are today afraid of the Chinese, rightly so. You taught them all the bad habits, and now you complain when you might be on the losing side a generation from now. So, there's a very big lesson that the Chinese learned with the Opium Wars. And that was, don't ever underestimate the white man, right? Prepare, 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 right? 200 years almost have gone by, or 170 years have gone by, and now they're ready. 2004, I don't know if any of you recall, in the summer of 2004, the Americans carried out the greatest naval exercise in history. It was called Operation Summer Pulse. And they carried out exercises in all the 7 theaters of the world. They blew up $3 billion in three weeks. They blew up missiles in the South China Sea. The Chinese kept quiet, completely quiet. When the exercise was over, the Chinese defense minister made a one-line statement. This can only come from a very confident civilization. And he said, we are not ready for you just yet. But in 10 years' time, we will be ready for you. Yeah. Ominous, ominous, ominous. So be careful, because modernity now is a cancerous contagion. And militarized modernity, I don't have to say, the adjective is superfluous, because modernity is by definition a military system. You know, the first standing armies are after the French Revolution. So, the question I have for you, Rupert, is: can we give some thought to the bag of habits which needs to be left behind, and where do we intend to leave them behind, and how? The third point, and this again is related to this one, my working hypothesis, my null hypothesis is, sorry for my statistical language, but I was dyed in the wool as an economist, so I find it hard to sometimes forget about it completely. But my null hypothesis is that a conquering culture can never understand true freedom, simply because of the fact of conquest. The Bible is 100% right. What profits a man if he wins the world and loses his soul? And losing your soul is precisely what loss of freedom is. And that's what Rabindranath was trying to say to the American president 105 years ago, right? So a conquering culture can at best offer a masquerade of freedom, also known as liberty, right? And that's where Isaiah Berlin comes in, and that's where John Rawls comes in, and that's where Amartya Sen comes in. And all the modern liberals share the illusion that liberty and freedom are identically the same thing. But to a spiritualist and a believer like myself, this is plain nonsense. This is nonsense for the simple reason that power is a zero-sum game. My power comes at the expense of your power. Your power comes at the expense of my power. My liberty, by the same token, comes at the expense of your liberty. Your liberty comes at the expense of mine. Subtractive. Freedom is additive. I cannot be free unless I make sure you are free, right? And this links up with Rupert's question, or rather book about Wittgenstein, right? I think Wittgenstein was one of the wisest sages the West has produced in centuries. And he understood this so well that he stopped talking, you know? Because what do you say? What do you say to gentlemen who know everything, but they're mad? And what do you say to a culture which has gone mad as a whole? You know, you can retreat into a cave, which he did when he went to Norway, and set himself up in a private hideout for 2 years and worked on his mathematics and logic and mathematical philosophy. Once you get exhausted of your solipsism, then you return and teach in a school in Austria, and you go and work with small children. And when you're done with that, you go back to Britain and you serve as a porter in a hospital to make sure that a millionaire's son learns how to do some physical work also, and so on. And a poor man, I mean, and like that, so many people in the Western world have had to quest for freedom individually, and known all along that you cannot quest for it individually only. You also have to quest for it socially and collectively. Otherwise, the individual freedom stands on a very, very thin edge. And it will require a solipsistic retreat into a cave sometime or another, ideally not in a metropolis. So that's the third point, Rupert, that liberty and freedom are not the same thing, and the liberals better acknowledge that now. They need to be told that quite clearly, and this has to be argued to them rigorously. The fourth related point is the question about autonomy. And I was quite tickled by your observation that Wittgenstein turns Kant on his head, much like Marx turns Hegel on his head. I have been reading for the last 3-4 years quite closely the Spanish Keralite philosopher theologian Raimundo Panikkar. And Panikkar uses a very interesting word which can help us out right now. And forgive me for introducing some jargon. If there are some non-philosophers here, I beg your pardon. He introduces the word ontogamy. And by ontogamy, he refers to a condition in which precisely my freedom is intimately bound up with your freedom. That is to say, my capacity to be myself in an authentic existential sense is directly proportional to your capacity to be yourself in an authentic existential sense. The additivity of freedom is implicit in the idea of autonomy. Autonomy has the risk of being completely misinterpreted, and the will to power works rather liberally in the guise of freedom. So between autonomy, heteronomy, and autonomy, I go with autonomy. And I say that the possibility of human collective harmony, in no matter how small or large a sphere, it doesn't matter, rests on our collective, educated, enlightened recognition that autonomy is a real possibility for humanity. That it takes all sorts to make a world. That each of us is necessary to the overall ecology of humanity and the earth, but none of us is indispensable. That may sound like a paradox, but it's mysteriously true, I think. So autonomy is another word for what you are calling relationality, but because it corresponds to the idiom of nomos, I sort of tossed it in because I think we might want to talk about it a little bit. And finally, last point, hardly the least, is Rupert's completely accurate remark, which I concur with 100%. When we find freedom, we will have to embrace ecology. And this is what took me to Rabindranath in the first place. I resumed my adult reading of Rabindranath because in India, you know, every child is bored to death in school with Rabindranath and Gandhi and taught by teachers who have no clue to either. And as an adult, you're pretty disgusted with the whole sort of moralizing that goes on around them. And then you realize as an adult also why they're so great and why they're so relevant and contemporary to us and how they could foresee 100, 200 years into the future. And from that, they warned humanity as true seers and prophets should. And the thing that that struck me most about Rabindranath is that all the way back in the 1890s, he was already seeing a planetary ecological crisis on the horizon. Hardly anybody, even in the Western world, was awake to that. And by the time you get to the 1920s, he's saying, look, this is ending. This civilization is finished. Do you see that? You know, he's saying it 100 years ago, Rupert. The train has entered the tunnel by the time people like us are born. We don't know we were born under a mountain. When they were born and living, they saw the sky and they saw the train enter the tunnel and they said, look, you're entering danger zone. This is Plato's cave and humanity is going to dig its grave over there, right? So be careful of the neons under the tunnel, right? Or in the tunnel. And that's what modernity and so-called post-modernity basically are, according to me. We're just lighting up the darkness with these neons, and now in digital. So there's abstract nature. There's what I'm calling in my book trans nature, which we inhabit now and which inhabits us. And technology is in command. Technology is habitat, and so on. Technology is tyrant. So when Rabindranath is interviewed by an Italian journalist in 1925, I think, he refers to the dominion of the machine. And Gandhi in Hind Swaraj, if you recall, has a whole evocative poetic chapter called Machinery. So in those days, the language was machinery. Today's language is technology. We've made so much progress in 100 years. So, but the important thing is, for Rabindranath, it's kind of not axiomatically, but experientially obvious that you can only find freedom in the intimacy of nature. If you do not embrace nature, and if you do not engage in a dialogue with nature, no resonance with nature, forget about freedom. You can go on talking about power as freedom after that, but freedom you've lost well and good. And he was very clear about this. it does not mean that he was a romantic in the blind sentimental sense, as so many worldly metropolitans would like to believe. For instance, he has a poem called Prithvi, which is earth in Bengali and Sanskrit and Hindi. And there he's talking about the sheer ruthlessness of the earth, how cruel the earth can be, how cruel the elements can be, especially when we don't heed them, right? Everybody thinks of a war with nature. Nobody's talking about the fact the real war is with the elements. You know, this is a Faustian bargain in which victory is impossible because you can't use the elements to destroy the elements. Forget about it. You know, I mean, Elon Musk is stupid, and all those who follow him are dumb because they don't see this obvious thing. This is not about conquest of nature. You've got to think about the elements. So Rabindranath was absolutely clear and blunt about it. And he said, look, you know, if you're talking about freedom, let's talk about nature. And I can talk more about this in discussion time, but that's where I'll stop, Thomas, if I haven't exceeded my time. If I have, then I'm really sorry.
No, this is perfect, Aseem. Thank you so much. Rupert, I just wonder if I can give straight away to Anat, or you want to have a brief reflection after Aseem?
You know, go to Anat, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Anat, please.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. That was fascinating, actually. I am a bit speechless after Aseem's talk. I'll try to take it from another angle. I'll try to insist on optimism, as Rupert actually suggests at the end of the book, this optimism of the will, which I think we must embrace. And actually, I think even Aseem does embrace slightly, because we have no other choice. And at the end of my intervention, I'll explain why in this particular moment, in this particular place where I'm speaking from, which is Israel-Palestine, I really cannot just give up on this. But first, I'll start with the compliments. Rupert, this is an amazing book, the Wittgenstein Liberatory Philosophy. It's simply amazing. I ran through most of it in a you know, just in one stroke, and I found it so enriching and so convincing and so clearly written. And I think it can be applied and can, you know, first of all in teaching, before we reach the political application, which is much harder to apply, I will argue. But first of all, within philosophy, I think it opens up really interesting scopes. So I agree with most of what you say, suggest, claim, or if it's possible to say such thing, with the reading, with the interpretation and the criticism I do have. I think it's more a criticism of Wittgenstein himself and where you adopt him, and not with you. And I'll reach that in a minute. So my first point is purely philosophical, purely about philosophical method, about the liberatory method, which, as I said, I think is fantastic. I think it's totally convincing, and it opens up for us scopes of new readings. And what I want to suggest is that we have now, with your book, and after Wittgenstein, of course, powerful tools for reading other philosophers, and not just saying, you know, put Wittgenstein, you know, on a sort of privileged stall, and then just think through Wittgenstein only, because I think what the liberatory reading does is taking us back actually to Plato and Berkeley, and I know it sounds shocking to you, but I'll explain in a minute. First of all, because you do embrace the distinction between reality and appearance. So you take us back in a non-dogmatic way, not in a pompous way, rather the opposite, to what makes philosophy, I think. I mean, if we are to be philosophers, we cannot give up on this distinction between reality and appearance. And I think many of the previous readings, and especially Hacker, as you show, but others as well, in wanting so much to overcome the distinction between reality and appearance, give up on philosophy. And I think that wasn't at all what Wittgenstein meant. And I think this is not what we should mean when we do philosophy. And here I'm going back to the Plato and Berkeley. You may remember that, in his conversation with Moore, Wittgenstein says about his own methodology that if he finds his place in the history of philosophy as a kink in the history of philosophy, and he suggests that he was following Plato and Berkeley. I'm quoting from memory, but I'm doing more or less the same as Plato and Berkeley, but in a different way. So these are the two stations that he chose to mention as following them, but in a kinky way. What he didn't want to do is to embrace common sense, any kind of common sense ideology, any kind of acceptance without questioning of what we are accustomed to see as all there is, as it is all here, and there's no problem seeing it. And I think this is something that Wittgensteinians tend to forget, and you bring it back very forcefully, I think. So metaphysics does that, and what I actually suggest, and again, it sounds radical, it sounds shocking, but I think it shouldn't be, is a new kind of metaphysics. I mean, you do bring back the license to do metaphysics seriously and honestly and daringly in a radical way. So yes, a metaphysical approach, not a theory, nothing that has to do with hypotheses. I don't think metaphysics has to do actually with hypotheses, but metaphysical pictures arouse the imagination in a way that shatters the commonsensical, shatters what we fail to see, our hidden dogmas. And I think now that we have your tool, which is very powerful, we can go on and apply it, first of all, within philosophy, then I reach the political, the purely political. But this, I think, is a political point. And it is a political point, and because of the examples I want to give at the moment. So I'm giving the examples I'm interested in because of my own tendency, philosophical tendency, particular tendency, but it works all over. And my political tendency, as you know, is Marxist, first of all. And then I feel I can read through Wittgenstein, and especially through a liberatory Wittgenstein, Voloshinov's work on Marxist philosophy of language, or Lecircle's take on this work on Voloshinov in a Deleuzian Marxist way. So we have many, many metaphysicians here, Voloshinov, Lecircle, and Deleuze, and Marx in the background. But we can approach this in this questioning mode, in this open mode that you suggest. Another one I would go back to is Marcuse and his criticism of the one-dimensional man. I think what Marcuse does, and forget about this awful chapter about Wittgenstein and Austin, which is really, really terrible. I think he didn't read Wittgenstein at all. I mean, he probably read something, but his examples are terrible, and his approach to Austin is as terrible as the other one. So forget about that chapter. But the whole treatment, the criticism of one-dimensional philosophy and one-dimensional men in general is, again, sort of metaphysical. And I think we can now come back to with the liberatory reading in philosophy. I'd say very briefly, just mention Brouwer's intuitionism because of Wittgenstein, because of my own tendencies, which I think you are aware of, and finish this list of rather modern names with Levinas and Derrida. And I think Levinas' ethical turn, and mainly Derrida's criticism of that turn. I mean, the joint effort of Levinas and Derrida is metaphysical in Derrida's critical essay of Levinas, The Violence of Metaphysics. This is highly metaphysical, and still it is highly political, and it is highly liberatory. And I think you give us, again, a way of reading it in a relaxed way, without blaming ourselves for being too metaphysical, which is now becoming okay again. So a last point on this goes a little bit further down, and this is to German idealism. I said that Wittgenstein mentioned Plato and Berkeley, and I think idealism indeed is a very fine example of the kind of metaphysics that he sort of wishes to do in a kinky way. But I think that both Fichte, which I think whom you mentioned in a critical way in your comment earlier, and rightly so, but both Fichte and Hegel do much of the same of what you wish to do regarding consciousness and regarding scientism. When Fichte says that there are no facts where consciousness is concerned, he makes a liberatory point. He says exactly what you want to say about our relationality and about the relation between consciousness and objecthood. And when Hegel criticizes, and this is what I wrote to you yesterday, when Hegel criticizes his contemporary science, for example, phrenology, the science of the skulls, his critique of that kind of scientism resembles that of Wittgenstein, especially in your reading. But I think Wittgenstein resonated for me when I read it first, but yesterday I read it again for another reason, and your book was in front of my mind and my eyes, and I thought, wow, that's exactly, they're doing exactly the same, the same kind of critique of scientism, because that kind of science, phrenology, takes humans to be objects. So, and all this, especially when we think of phrenology and its political reverberance and its political consequence, we see how all this metaphysical tour has a direct political implications. So this is something I suggest us all we do, and I think you enable us to do that. What I wouldn't do is embrace some of the philosophers you seem to favor, and I favor less. And I'll mention here, I'll only mention Searle, actually. I want to say something about Habermas, but we did that a year ago a little bit, and I don't want to come back to that. But Searle is a very good example of bad philosophy, I think, because he's so dogmatic. And I think you mistreat Derrida in his anti-dogmatic approach towards him in his signature event context. He problematizes the obvious and the ordinary, which are very dogmatic in Searle's own reading. So I think Searle is exactly the kind of dogmatic, non-liberatory philosopher you want to detach yourself from. And another word in this vein, and final word on this point, is about Wittgenstein interpreters. You say a lot about Höcker's reading, and I agree with this criticism. I do think, though, that other interpreters, later interpreters, and I hesitantly, but yeah, I do want to add Diamond and Conant as well to that list of what Critchley called, and actually called it towards Diamond, the Wittgensteinian police force. I think you detach yourself from when you detach yourself from therapy. This is precisely the kind of police force that you detach yourself from. The therapeutic approach knows the truth and knows where we are going and knows, and dictates. And this is precisely the thing that you achieve so wonderfully. So I think you don't have to shy from criticizing your sources of inspiration as well. They may be sources of inspiration and still be dogmatic and resounding police force at the same time. So that's about that more methodological, philosophical point. About the political, or the concrete political, I think the concrete is lacking. I think the concrete is lacking from Wittgenstein, first of all. I mean, he makes a lot of fuss about respecting the particular case and despising our craving for generality. But the particular is not concrete. And I think we should pay attention to the difference between particular and concrete. Because the particular, when you emphasize the particular, it's a nice and good philosophical point, it's an ethical point, but it's not a political point. And I have reservations about that kind of ethicism. I think you do too, but not enough in my view. You do criticize Cavell for not being enough political, and I think this is the kind of criticism I would push much further. So when we want to be concrete, we have to dare say things, and we have to dare say things which are much less general than anti-scientism and even anti-liberalism and even anti-growthism. And this is where my last point about the Palestinian struggle will enter in a moment. So these are very convincing points. I mean, the against scientism, liberalism, and growthism, and I agree with them. But I think they still remain on a sort of generalized level, ethical level, that is not enough concrete and political, in my view. So that we have very wide brushstrokes, which I think we should focus on their details, and focus on the details regarding scientism, for example, is asking where exactly we want to oppose science. And actually, in the previous webinar, which was held about this book, Catherine Morris made the same point. Now, after Trumpism, we should be wary about criticizing science in general. Now, with the opposition to vaccinations, I mean, there are things that we shouldn't be too light about. And exactly the same about liberalism. I totally share your criticism of Rawls and liberalism. And being a Marxist, it's very easy for me to just say that. But still, there is something in liberalism. If you take, the totalitarian view or the Arendtian view, what Arendt was criticizing, then you see that liberalism is again something that we should maybe cherish a little bit. So that is the thing about that. And finally, being particular or being concrete, I cannot embrace not the pessimism, not even, some of the things that Aseem said that I sympathized with. But from my own point of view, the struggle of the liberation of the Palestinian people and the struggle against Zionism, the struggle against the state of Israel as it is now, the urge for an international involvement for Palestine and against Zionism is something very, very concrete. And I cannot just see how it is derived and can be derived from very general liberatory readings. Maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe we cannot. It's not a deductive system, and it's okay that we cannot deduce everything from that. But my point is that we need a little bit of of the light of progress, or the Marxist optimism, in order to struggle, in order to think of the real liberation, the freedom in the old sense, which you easily criticize. And I agree with the criticism in a general manner, the criticism of not being too obsessed with freedom. But when I'm thinking of the Palestinian political prisoners, for example, then yes, the freedom in a traditional sense, this is what I wish, first of all, for them. When I'm talking about mass incarceration in the States, for example, again, this is the kind of, let's first deal with that before we question the idea of freedom. And I think the questions and both attitudes go along each other, and along with the ecological point which Aseem emphasized. So actually, that's, I think, where I'll end.
Thank you so much. We have rich material. Rupert, Aseem, Anat, I would like to add a few words before I give over to Rupert. But I know, Rupert, you must be very eager to come in. Let me see if I can cut down my remarks to just a few elements. Some philosophical, some political, but actually all are the same. Let me first note just that the agreement I have with especially some of what Anat said is about the quality of your book, Rupert, especially the book about Wittgenstein. I think it's time to see and read the work of Wittgenstein as a game changer in political philosophy, and to see the unity of his critique of modernity and his rethinking of the idea of foundations of philosophy, his rethinking of the Western idea of reason. And I was in Frankfurt with Habermas in the summer term 1984. That's when Habermas and Foucault planned a joint seminar. It was supposed to be held in Paris in August 1984. And then one Monday we came to the seminar, and Habermas announced the passing away of Foucault a few days earlier. That was a high time of their effort to rethink the foundations of modern reason. I think that debate was the best we had at the time, but it did not appreciate the relevance of Wittgenstein for those issues about how politics relates to the Western aspiration towards enlightenment. I think they failed to see what Wittgenstein brings to those debates. And that's where I think your book, Rupert, brings attention to the exact place, the exact role of Wittgenstein in relation to the crisis of modernity. I think it is in the way he gives us tools and resources to rethink the Western dream that reason could be a company, could be a friend of liberation. That's the level where I see the contribution is important. I would like to go into some detail about that, but let me first say, to frame that, come to one point which may seem more purely political, and maybe the only point where I have some serious disagreement with your civilization, the book Civilization is Finished, and also I think a point of tension with some of what Aseem said. It relates to Anat's question about optimism and pessimism, and relates to what you have said about collapse, the collapse of this civilization. I first want to say that among the four of us, possibly Anat is with me there, but I'm I take more seriously, I think, than you have, Rupert, and than you have, Aseem, more seriously the legitimacy of techno-optimism of Elon Musk. I disagree with them so much in their proposals. I think it's very, very dangerous what they're proposing. But I think the idea, the green movement, which I grew up with, the Nordic environmental movement, was very much saying what you just said, namely that industrial growth civilization is finished and that it can't survive. And what I think now is that this is that kind of a prophecy about the future, that kind of self-righteousness cannot be sustained. There's enormous risks with technology. The price paid every day by the ones who are conquered, to use Aseem's phrase, that price is extremely high. But it's also true that that's my position, there's a long debate, of course, there's enormous risk with technology, but who can say for sure that it will not deliver the geoengineering, genetic modification? It will change everything, transform civilization. But who knows whether it will survive? I think this is there in something Wittgenstein wrote in the 1940s about the future, that industrial civilization may be the future. It may be a terrible one, but we don't know that it will be a collapse. My criticism of techno-fancy, techno-optimism is not that it will lead to collapse. My criticism is that it will lead to loss of freedom. And loss of freedom in a sense which is there in Gandhi's critique, and I suppose in Rabindranath Tagore's critique. But it also means a loss of freedom in a sense which is deeply ingrained and available in the Western tradition. And I'll go to that. That's my second point. The first point was that I'm worried about being so self-righteous in addressing the techno-optimism. That's my first point. And I think Wittgenstein can help us see through that kind of self-righteousness in any debate. That's his Socratic strand. That at the end of the day, we put our bets here and explain them, and what else can we do? But to come to the question of freedom, again, I feel close to Anat, that German idealism, Fichte and Hegel, have resources for defining, and this relates to Rousseau's critique of modernity, and the early French Enlightenment conception of autonomy, that freedom is something we must share. Freedom is democracy. That this kind of self-determination that the Western individual seeks is a determination which can only be true together with others in democratic communities. This was articulated already by Rousseau. It was re-articulated by the German idealists and by Kant. It is re-articulated again by Habermas, but I think more deeply rethought in Wittgenstein. But the basic principle is that in conversation, nobody owns the truth. And I can only know what a word like freedom means to me if I can be part of a certain community with you in which we try to understand by working together more deeply what freedom could mean for us. Because I don't own the word freedom. I must share it with you. I must share my convictions, my worries, my concrete examples will give me evidence of how my reactions, what I can say about this case, about that case, about Palestinian prisoners, about incarceration in the US. Only when I can share with you what I think about that case, only then can I learn from you how to deepen my conception of freedom. And that conversation about freedom is a conversation where nobody can stand alone. It is a question of sharing. It's a question of deepening the search. It's a question where metaphysics and the ordinary come together. It's an issue where the everyday and the philosophical are inseparable. So the unity of the search for my freedom and the search for freedom for my community is something which is the heart of all truth-seeking politics and all truth-seeking philosophy. And I think that insight, Michael Teunissen, my teacher in Berlin, has written a beautiful book about how this conception of freedom is available in Hegel's philosophy. And I think your book, Rupert, brings out how that conception of freedom, freedom as democratic practice, as sharing how that conception of freedom is available in the later Wittgenstein. So I want to signal that as things I think we share deeply, but I think it's part of that search for freedom that that the idea that collapse is imminent, no matter how important it is, it's an idea we to place in public debate and then confront the critiques of that more than I think you have done in the Civilization is Finished book. I want to close because I want to give some time to Rupert to you. I want to close with one remark about where I see Gandhi and Gandhi's Hind Swaraj as relevant to these issues we are discussing, and in one aspect superior to anything I have found in Wittgenstein. And that is in the idea of conversation, in the idea of the dialogic search for truth that's at the heart, I think, of Wittgenstein's philosophy. I don't think you can that you can really define your position on violence through that conception of, the deepest form of engagement in rationality is the unending skeptical search for the meaning of our words. If that's how you think of the unity of philosophy and the search for freedom, then there's no stopping people to hark back to maybe I'll just put it blunt like this. Unless there is a independent commitment to nonviolence, the other conception of freedom as power to control nature and power to achieve my purpose independent of the others, and power not to be my purposes, be transformed by the engagement with the other. Those options, those violent options, cannot be reduced to overcome through a commitment to freedom unless it's independently a commitment to nonviolence. I think that's why ahimsa, nonviolence, is an independent virtue and a commitment in Gandhi, and not the same as a commitment to truth. That's my reading of Hind Swaraj. I wanted to mention that. I know it's a complicated matter, and I will leave you, Rupert, with these few topics, and so many topics brought out by Aseem and Anat. Thank you so much.
Wow, I feel so privileged to have had three such amazing responses to my work and to the terrible and perhaps hopeful dilemma of our times. Just fantastic stuff. Let me do the best I can to cover some of the key points in response, and then let's see if we can go to our audience. I'll start with some of Thomas's remarks. I am actually pretty cautious in This Civilization is Finished not to prognosticate, and I try to take a fundamentally precautionary attitude instead. But I do believe that to survive as a civilization, a real transformation is going to be needed. And in that sense, that to save civilization, we're going to have to end this civilization. What survives through that transformation may involve plenty of technology, but I'm prepared to stick my neck out and say I do not believe that it will be fundamentally a continuation of what we have. I might be wrong, but I'm very, very confident of that. Why am I so confident of that? Well, in brief, one reason why is through the lens of climate. It is just not possible to carry on anything resembling the sort of the path we have, or the eco-modernist path, so-called, and not end up with 3 to 4 degrees of global overheat. And in the long term, that is not going to be compatible with our civilization continuing. It will not be capable of producing food to keep this many people alive. You might say, well, but what about geoengineering? They could throw the dice in that way, and maybe they would keep it staggering forward. But geoengineering deepens our trance, really. It's just more of the same. It's just taking it to a whole nother level of extremity. It deepens our fantasy of control. And I think that the chances that geoengineering will work out neatly are fantastically remote. And the work that's been done so far looking hypothetically into geoengineering scenarios suggests that quite strongly. So I may be wrong, but I think it's a safe bet that this civilization is finished, which, to repeat, does not mean that we're bound to collapse. Does not mean that we're restricted to choosing between Phoenix and Dodo. There is the possibility of Butterfly, but my claim is that Butterfly will not be possible unless it involves a genuine transformation. And eco-modernism is just an attempt to have a sort of greener caterpillar. It's not going to work. I might be wrong, but I'm as sure of that as I'm sure of quite a lot of other things. Turning to Anat's remarks, I'm fascinated by your reading of my book, Anat, which as soon as you started to give it, I kind of saw what it was that you were going to say, because it fits beautifully with your own trajectory in philosophy. And I see what you mean. I mean, I do argue in the book that there are some important senses in which we should not understand Wittgenstein as leaving everything as it is. I do make unusual alignments of him, for example, with Voloshinov and Bakhtin, with Merleau-Ponty. And I do very obviously suggest a fundamental set of challenges to the fundamental assumptions that rule us. And I think all I can say really is I'm really interested in what you propose there. I would like to explore it further, and I would love you to explore it further. And let's see where it goes. I'm glad also that you brought up the point about therapy, because that is an important change in my focus that is registered in this book. That until relatively recently, I was well known as a therapeutic reader of Wittgenstein, and I've sort of repudiated that here in this new book. And therefore, I've, among other things, sort of repudiated the framing that Alice Crary used in the introduction to our edited collection, The New Wittgenstein, which very much focused on the therapeutic metaphor. And I do believe, as I've argued in detail in the book, that liberation is immeasurably superior, both on exegetical grounds and on substantive grounds, as a basis for understanding Wittgenstein. So thank you for bringing that out. Turning to Aseem. So I'm grateful, Aseem, for you bringing up Gandhi and Hind Swaraj, which Thomas has just recently embroidered on. I think there is a profound connection between what Gandhi is trying to do in Hind Swaraj and what I'm trying to do in Wittgenstein's liberatory philosophy, and what I see Wittgenstein is trying to do. Wittgenstein and Gandhi, of course, shared certain inspirations in common, including notably Tolstoy. Gandhi seeks to show in Hind Swaraj how it will not be possible for a country to achieve freedom, or people to achieve freedom, unless the individuals in that country achieve freedom of thought, and unless they achieve that freedom of thought and then freedom as a people together. And I think Hind Swaraj is a profound work of philosophy for that reason. I love also, obviously, your invocations of Rabindranath Tagore, and I love the idea that I'm 100 years late with This Civilization is Finished. Philosophy really does paint its grey on grey. The Owl of Minerva has been flying for a long time, apparently. I'm sure you're right. For what I'm seeking to show above all in Wittgenstein's liberatory philosophy is that Wittgenstein offers us true freedom of thought. And then that freedom, as it were, expands into life. So that's why I talk about autonomy as being relationality. I'm very interested in your invocation of Panika there. I'm afraid I find it very difficult to read Panika. I must have another go sometime. I really find it very challenging to read him at all. But yes, the concept of autonomy does indeed seem to be what I am talking about. So yes, I think of Wittgenstein as offering us a really profound vision of freedom of thought, of showing how autonomy, true autonomy, has to be equivalent to relationality in a setting of nature and of wonder. I think here of Wittgenstein's lovely remark, man has to awaken to wonder, science has a way of sending him to sleep again. So yeah, this is one place where we connect with Wittgenstein's deep critique of scientism and of technophilia. As Anat says, we have to be careful with applying that now, because we live in a world where scientism is still, I would argue, plainly hegemonic, but is not hegemonic absolutely everywhere. And Catherine Morris did indeed bring that out very nicely the other day. There are pockets where its hegemony has been pushed back against. Think about how this works. Take the concrete example of COVID-19. On the one hand, there has clearly been scientism in the way that the response to COVID-19 has developed. You can see that very clearly in the way that epidemiologists have been at the forefront of the response, rather than public health experts, let alone experts in the precautionary principle or philosophy, who should, I would argue, have been more listened to in this regard. Myself and Aseem Talib and colleagues were speaking out in January and February of last year, demanding the kinds of measures that most people in medicine only started talking about weeks later, and those were crucial lost weeks. So there's scientism there. There's also scientism in the very way that epidemiology is framed. I mean, epidemiology is in part a social science, i.e., according to Wittgenstein and Peter Winch, not a science at all. And that point isn't understood at all widely because of the scientism of our culture. But on another hand, there are people who are pushing back against this, not just against scientism, but against science itself, the anti-vaxxers and so forth. And that has to be allowed. And we have to be careful that a critique of scientism doesn't legitimate such idiocies. And that risk has been run by some, notably Steve Fuller has helped to support such idiocies in the past. And to some extent, I think also Bruno Latour and some of the postmodernists have done so. The way that the anti-lockdown and anti-vaxxer people in COVID have pushed back against science has not, it seems to me, been very effective. And in fact, the COVID crisis has hugely re-legitimated science on balance, and may therefore make it more difficult now for us to critique effectively scientism. So it's quite a complicated picture, and yeah, we have to examine that complexity. And as you say, Anat, similarly with liberalism, we need to make sure that in critiquing liberalism as a political philosophy, and in critiquing, as Aseem did beautifully, embroidering on my own remarks, critiquing the attachment, the clinging to liberty, rather than to the kind of vision of freedom and liberation, which I've sought to expound from Wittgenstein. In critiquing liberalism as a political philosophy, we have to make sure that we don't undermine the importance of political liberties, especially at a time of COVID, when governments are taking advantage of lockdowns to be, in some cases, authoritarian. So where does that leave us or leave me? I feel profoundly in sympathy with most of the remarks that you all made. We need to try to aspire to developing what the Chinese are calling, in a brilliant framing, an ecological civilization. We can only do so by finding freedom and by finding it together, as Aseem said, and as Thomas said. At the end of my Wittgenstein book, I describe this using the new concept of co-liberation, which I think is quite a rewarding and useful concept. I'd like to say at this point also that that I resonated very deeply with what Aseem was saying when he basically said most people in the West are doomed to try to find freedom alone, and it can't be done. I mean, I've been feeling hugely in the past year or two the lack of genuine community, and I'm inclined to say something like genuine life in the society in which I exist. The way that COVID has separated us into isolated households has only, it seems to me, actually shone a clear lens on this basic absurdity and insanity of the way that we live. You know, virtually all of us live almost alone or in very tiny groups in these boxes, separated from each other, with very little to really bind us together, very little rootedness, very little by way of ritual or genuine tradition. You know, I want to live in some kind of community where we sing a lot together and we have fires together and stuff like that. I mean, it sounds just so remote from the actual way that we are enabled or taught to live in the world that we live in, and it seems to me that it's a huge wound to us that we don't have that kind of community, that kind of freedom building together. And final remark then, I loved Aseem's paradoxical finishing point. Each of us is necessary to the world, but none of us is indispensable. The lens through which I would view that is through the lens of grief. In other words, there's a huge grief in me, at any rate, at the absence of the kind of community I just described. There's a huge grief at the way we are destroying our beautiful world and the amazing inheritance we should be leaving to our children. What grief is realizing that the necessary can be dispensed with. This would be the wrinkle I would give to Aseem's remark. In other words, when something is necessary to your life, when somebody or some aspect of the world is necessary to you, and you nevertheless lose it, you nevertheless have it ripped from you, that is what brings about grief. And that connects also with the deep importance, which I try to explore in my Wittgenstein book, of the second person and of the first person plural as ways of understanding community and ways of understanding what it means to end the civilization of separation, which we've had for far too long now in our world, and especially in the West. And I do believe that in the future of philosophy, if there is to be a future, we won't have this kind of obsessive battle between the first person singular and the third person, which ultimately turn out to be basically the same thing. But instead there'll be a taking seriously of the first person plural and of the second person. And that is something which gives me some hope. And as Anat rightly said, we're nowhere without some optimism of the will. I think all four of us share some optimism of the will.
Thank you, Rupert. Thank you so much. I will briefly mention two topics before I give over to Aseem and Anat. I think it resonates with some of what all of you have said. Namely, if there's something there in Wittgenstein's method which links the political and the philosophical more acutely than anything else, I think it is the emphasis on not knowing too early what the other is saying. We are not, before we reject, or before we oppose something, we need to understand it. And I think two examples which did play a big role in Wittgenstein's development was the sense that there's something wrong with scientism, which he himself as a young man wanted to, he wanted to found the foundation of scientific worldview in logicism. And then he never rejected that idea, but he wanted to understand it, he wanted to respect it. But in the understanding, I think he reshaped our idea what place the scientific or scientist project could have in the house of reason, to put it that way. Similarly, I think freedom, the conception of freedom, which you have been criticizing here, and I share the critique, the worry about the loneliness of the free individual in the liberal tradition. But before we reject and oppose that notion of freedom, And I think Wittgenstein did oppose it. Before we reject it or oppose it and replace it with a communitarian dream of the kind maybe, Rupert, you suggested, we need to understand what is there and what makes this a candidate for the honorific term freedom. And I think so then we can keep our understanding, we can keep the respect for the other, and we can invite the other, see what may be the limits of that lonely conception of freedom. And then maybe the other may be invited to share with us a larger conception. So then you would have a meeting of dreams of various nature without a competition between them. There's a kind of non-competitive element in the method, in the dialogic method, which plays out in Wittgenstein's late work, which I think is similar to what plays out in the Socratic dialogues, in the early Platonic dialogues, where when Socrates closes, says goodbye to his fellow travelers in the discussion and says that nobody, we have shared views, but we have not arrived at truth, but we have still learned together. I leave it there for not to monopolize, and I'm sure Aseem, Anat, who wants to go first?
Thank you, Thomas, but I do want to clarify if the audience will have a chance to ask questions, and I don't want to take up too much of their time. I have a lot to say, but I don't want to, again, colonize time.
Thank you, Aseem. Yes, thank you for bringing this out. Unfortunately, the technical output we have today doesn't easily allow people to speak. You can pick from the chat if you are versatile technically.
Sure. Yeah,
and it will be welcome and much appreciated.
Yeah, let's start encouraging people to put questions in the chat
in
now,
the chat.
or in the Q&A.
Yes, Rupert, thanks for that. Thanks, Aseem.
So there's a lot to say, and I'm going to try to be brief. First of all, I should clarify that I am neither a pessimist nor an optimist, but as William James once said, I'm a possibilist. So I do believe in possibilities, and I do believe that in every single undefinable, ineffable moment of life, there are infinite possibilities. So in that sense, I'm a permanent, eternal optimist. I don't think the binary between optimism and pessimism is terribly helpful, and it tends to typecast each of us in boxes which are not comfortable. So that's just by way of a preface, and I'm completely with you, Anat, in the statement, which if I interpret correctly, is that we don't need the right metaphysics to actually understand the Palestinian struggle. I hope I'm not paraphrasing you too crudely, but I feel the same way about Kashmir. I feel the same way about Nagaland. I feel the same way about the farmers' movement right now in India. There are black and white issues which children can understand, but prime ministers fail to understand, and experts never get it. So I think that philosophy, like Marx said, philosophers have only interpreted the world, etc., etc. So we don't need to go on with interpretations of things which are redundant, waste of mental time. The discussion about whether we need the light of progress is a tricky one, and I wouldn't enter into it here. I'll only refer to the Walter Benjamin quote about the angel of history. And those of us who've been under the wheel of the chariot feel differently about the chariot than those of us who ride the chariot or who command the chariot. And Rabindranath in China in 1924 made that metaphor. It's not my metaphor about chariot. You can read about it in an essay called Civilization and Progress, where he sharply distinguishes the one from the other. It's one of Rabindranath's clearest lectures to the Chinese in 1924. It's called Civilization and Progress. Coming to some of Thomas's remarks, which were very, very interesting. I mean, I'm so enriched by this evening's discussion that I don't know where it will end, because I don't want it to end. It's not out of a sense of self-righteousness, I feel, that Rupert titles the book as he does, and nor out of a sense of self-righteousness that I feel that certain paths ought to be closed off with regards to the future. It's out of a very, very empirical, clear and present danger. I don't think there are any two ways about it. On the one hand, if we are going to say yes to science and no to scientism, then I think it's very clear that we need to believe the evidence that science is throwing at us, which is attested to also by our own direct experience of the natural world right now. I'll give you a simple example. I have very intimate links with a Himalayan village, which had 7 snowfalls in December and January last year, and has had none this year, and had none the previous 5 years before last year. So you have rhododendrons growing and blossoming in January, which has baffled every botanist in the subcontinent. So there is empirical evidence, too much of it actually, for our comfort. So certain paths just have to be closed off. And I think that we have to be very clear about the distinction between science and scientism. In practical terms, this is a deeply political and a spiritual question. It's no longer just an epistemic indulgence. So that's the thing about the point about the prophecy about the future. It's not to be self-indulgent. There are reasons why every culture in the history of the world has had myths like the Icarus myth or the Promethean myth. And in our own lore in India, there are 100 myths like that. There are reasons why that existed. So there was wisdom, which was squandered, inadvertently perhaps, but it was squandered because of the triumphs of science. Because suddenly the comparison between science, the epistemic comparison between science and myth was flattened out to criteria which suited the interests of science rather than myth. I'm being crude in order to simplify our discussion right now. I actually completely share your fear, Thomas, that the civilization will not so much collapse as lead to continuous, permanent losses of freedom every day, every moment. When you have the world's largest nuclear arsenal on your side, you don't collapse by next Thursday. You make the whole planet radioactive before you think of collapsing yourself, right? So there is going to be a permanent and continuous loss of freedom. And here is my honest view. I don't think there is a free person in this world today. This is not said from arrogance. This is simply said from what people feel and experience. And there's a reason. And Wittgenstein has said this. If I remember right, the remark is people can go on living indefinitely in a condition of unfreedom without being able to articulate that they are not free. This is Wittgenstein, not me. I can't remember where he says this, but he does. So I am with you there. I think the real danger we are already courting and inviting further. There's a fire on which we are living, and we are not aware that we are throwing fuel into the fire by the sheer way in which we are being made to live physically. So that's very important to understand, I feel. I actually, following Lewis Mumford and Panikkar, I distinguish between 3 things. I'm moving on to your next point, Thomas, and which is related to this point, which is that the 3 things are techne, technology, and technocracy. All cultures throughout human history have techne. Not all cultures have technology, and only this culture in which we are living is technocracy. I have no doubt in saying, I have no confusion in saying that I am completely against technocracy, and I think all of us here would be, but I don't want to speak for others. Technology is the gray area between the two, and that's where a lot of discussion is necessary. And I think Hannah Arendt's last chapter in The Human Condition is relating precisely to that, and is trying to clarify a domain for political collective action in the domain of technology so as to be able to get to a techne which is ecologically sound. I'm quoting Barry Commoner here in Making Peace with the Planet and in a Berkeley lecture he gave in 1973 when he talked about ecologically sound technology. I think of Schumacher, I think of Ivan Illich, I think of Gandhi, Tagore, and 100 other people. So that's very important. And when Lewis Mumford talks about mega techniques, today you might talk about giga techniques and nano techniques. I think his main point is that when technology gets to be in command and has a life of its own, and that man is no longer is even man the measure of all things, but machine is the measure of all things. That's deadly. That's lethal. And that is a completely political, not a technical question, which has to be opposed to political, spiritual, philosophical, ethical, ecological grounds. And that's just not happening. People are looking for technical answers to what are fundamentally social, human, ethical questions. It's a pandemic. That's the true pandemic, if you ask me. The next point about technology is that we, given where we were born, I'm here talking about myself and people like my parents and my students. Technology has been used for colonization for so many centuries that we can't possibly trust it. We are always going to be suspicious, and not because we are peasants, but because we have lived history. And that is something which the West has to understand as to where our fears are rooted. You know, when the British came and conquered us in the middle of the 19th century, when they went to Rajputana, Rajasthan is one of the bravest states in the country historically. People are fighters there. People are warriors there. They are Kshatriyas. They said, if you want to fight, man, come close. Don't shoot at me with a gun from so many miles away, you know? So, the understanding of valor was very different from modern cowardly warfare, right? And I'm sorry if I bring up cricket here, but you got an experience of that valor when India defeated Australia with its B team. Australia is the best team in the world. India's B team defeated it in the cricket series last week. And it made huge history here, huge. The effects are more than all political changes taking place. So, so technology, if it's going to be used for colonization of cultures, of nature and the cosmos, and that's why I brought up Elon Musk, can't possibly lead to freedom. It can lead to power and more power, and the will to power goes on expanding. That's why I brought up Bacon. I also feel that this is intrinsic to modernity, that conquest and technology are so written into the DNA of modernity that people would not regard themselves as modern, neither from the side of the success, but the succeeding people, nor from the side of those who fail. They will not recognize something as modern if conquest and colonization are not involved. I'm writing about this. I'm writing a whole volume on it, so hopefully it will become clear to you. And that has to be asked. So what is the civilization you are trying to save exactly? And what is the civilization you're trying to create? Can you please clarify and specify that difference in the clearest possible terms, which will be believed by those cultures which have lost? Okay, I'll just finish with one more comment. I'm trying to pick the right comment to close with because there's still a lot to say. Yes. The terms on which we argue or discuss or dialogue about freedom have to be very, very mutually well understood. And here I'll just close with a quotation from Panikkar, since the passage came to my mind while I was listening. It's a very short passage, but it'll take about 30 seconds. It says, quote, "A great deal has been written in our days on the intercultural dialogue. And although much has improved, the table of dialogue has not generally been a round table. It has been too hastily supposed that other cultures ought to come to our table, where we eat with the knife of dollars and the English fork on the tablecloth of democracy, understood our way, on plates served up by the state, drinking the wine of progress and using the spoons, baby spoons more recently, of technological development, while we sit on the chairs of history. So
Thank you
that's
so much,
the nature
Aseem.
of the difficulty. Yeah, thank you.
I will
I'm
invite.
sorry for going over.
No, Aseem, it's very important and beautiful what you say. I live in the hope that all civilizations have resources for renewal, and that technocracy is not the only model possible of modern civilization. But if it is, I tend to sort of share so much what you just said. But Rupert, we have questions in the QA. I wonder if, Rupert, you should take the floor now. And I wonder if you would like to pick up on the questions that have been given by attendees.
Yeah, so there's a few questions I would like to try to answer. So briefly, in responding to Lothar, hi Lothar. Lothar asks, how would you relate your idea of liberation to the concept of emancipation, i.e. in Marx, in the context of Wittgenstein? So we've been touching on this, and I do think there is a potential genuine relation. I'm not going to try to explain it here because it would take too long, but in very simple terms, I do see there as being a potential real confluence between Marx and Wittgenstein, provided we have a Marx who is anti-scientistic, and provided we have a Marx that is not obsessed with conquering nature. There are moments in Marx's sort of more humanistic phases, and also when he's talking philosophically about commodity fetishism and so on, there are moments that are very kind of proto-Wittgensteinian, and when he and Engels critique language in the way that they do, and I've explored some of those in previous work. So really, if you want a proper answer to this question, do have a read of my published essays on Marx and Wittgenstein. Now I want to take two questions together. There is a question in the Q&A. Is there a decisive reason why you, Mr. Read, think that environmental engineering, etc., cannot help us? Firms committing to climate neutrality, etc., seem to be the gospel of those who admit the severity of the problem, but they want to stick to our Western socio-economic systems. Why are they mistaken? And similarly, in the chat, we have from Pivy, we have, doesn't science and technological progress increase people's freedom in the long run, or do you think it limits freedom, at least if we use science and technology in environmentally friendly and ethical ways? So these two questions, my response to them is pretty similar to what Aseem has been saying. I think it is at the end of the day naive to have these kinds of hopes and ideas about science and technology and corporations and so forth. We ought to take much more seriously the limits to growth work of the Club of Rome and others. We ought to take very seriously what the Stockholm Resilience Center has been showing us about planetary boundaries. If we take these things seriously, then it becomes clear that there is not the scope that there has been claimed to be for so-called green growth, and that the idea of endless technological progress runs up against entropic and other limits. Now, going back to the first of those two questions, why don't these firms, etc., realize that? Are they mistaken? Well, yeah, basically they are, or they're not really trying to think the huge picture. I use huge rather than big. Big pictures are not big enough anymore. I think there is hardly anybody who is across the extent of our crisis vis-a-vis limits to growth, planetary boundaries, and so forth. And that's because of hyper-specialization, and that's because of scientism, and it's because of also an unwillingness to actually try to look Because when you, and this would be the Wittgensteinian point, that the problem is, at the end of the day, is not that people aren't clever enough to see, it's that they don't want to see. Because when you really look with open eyes across our systems, it seems to me, it is really hard, and I've been struggling with this in the last several months, it is really hard to hold on to much optimism of the will that the butterfly model might be achievable. The crisis that we face, the multiple systemic interlocking crises, are so vast. The degree of honesty and understanding about them is so thin, especially in terms of seeing them together. Basically, what most people in governments and corporations, and I speak to these people, in some of my political work, I know them. I'm not just speculating here. But what they don't understand. They don't understand how bad things are, and that's for various reasons, as I say, including that they don't really want to understand. And they don't really want to understand because they don't want to abandon some version of their current trajectory. You can see this, for example, in Mark Carney in his recent brief lectures. He's really trying to propose that if we're all sort of nice and good and sensible and make good policy wonk type decisions and changes, then we can keep the world going and keep economic growth going and not have any kind of collapse. These people don't want to face reality. And reality is going to, and this is why I think that collapse of some kind or another is so likely. Reality is starting to bite us. It has been quite hard now for a few years, and this is only the beginning. These heads of corporations and politicians and so on, they're just hoping that it's all going to work out, or they're hoping that some massive techno fix is going to come to save us, or they're hoping that the scientists have got it wrong. These hopes are incredibly vain, and this is why, coming back to what Thomas said, this is why I sometimes worry that I am too optimistic, and that the butterfly possibility is so slim now. But I find it difficult to let go of it completely, because the situation is very frustrating. Because, of course, in principle, the butterfly possibility is perfectly possible. It's just that when you're dealing with the actual concatenation of power in our world, and with how late we've left it, and with how little willingness there is still even now, although it's not as bad as it was a few years ago, but how little willingness there is even now to face up to the full gravity of the situation, it's difficult to remain optimistic, and it's difficult frankly, to retain one's mental health.
Thank you, Rupert. We don't have many minutes left, but I would like to give to Anat the vital reality. If you're in Israeli prison, or if you're in the camps in Libya trying to reach Europe, reality has reached you in a way which most bosses of firms Rupert were referring to hasn't reached them yet. I wonder, Anat, if you want to add something to the discussion. I would also invite Rupert and Aseem to prepare final notes of this discussion. We all have the sense that this is just the beginning. Rupert's big books are there. So they will give us lots of food for thought, which we can't all chew and digest here in one session. Anat, would you like to?
I'll just say very briefly, first of all, the ecological perspective. I learned from Rupert a few years ago that I live in such a place that will be more or less the first to become a desert once the temperature is rising, and there's hardly any awareness of this at all is here in this region, which is frightening. And I tend to connect it to the acute political situation and the very concrete one, what I try to emphasize is the concrete problems that we're facing, as if, you know, there's nothing concrete about being terminated or being just boiled in a few years' time. But I think it's very important for us to remember that and to emphasize that, and that was a sort of wake-up call that was important for me to remember. So thank you for that again, for that reminder. Apart from this, I think I don't want to repeat other stuff, and I just urge you to follow and support our case, I mean, as much as possible. And if you others, I mean, who are not already in contact with me, just write to me, and I'll just supply you with links and to-do lists from here to eternity in support of the Palestinian cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Anat. Aseem.
Well, I'm again going to try to be brief, and which better philosopher to go to than Wittgenstein when one has to be brief. So he says in one of my most favorite Wittgenstein aphorisms, obviously unpublished in his lifetime, the place where I'd like to be is the place I already must be at this moment. The place I would like to be is the place I must already be at this moment. In other words, I'm not fully aware of this moment. And therein is paradise. In our language, in Urdu, in India, by a very long mile, my favorite poet in all the languages that I know is Mirza Ghalib, 19th century Urdu poet. And for him, Jannat, which is to say paradise, is always available, but we don't look in the right direction. Our gaze is turned the wrong way. Like Simone Weil would say, sin is nothing but our gaze in the wrong direction. So he says, Jannat ki hakikat hame malum hai, lekin dil ko khush rakhne ke liye Ghalib ye khayal acha hai. I do know the reality of heaven, but for the time being, this thought will stand in its place. Right? Or as Jorge Luis Borges said in one of his beautiful stories, I read it in Spanish, he says, if I can remember, the translation would go, let heaven exist even if our estate be hell. So the point I'm trying to make here in all these three quotations is the following. I have very little faith left in political modernity, and the reason is that it chases utopias. In other words, the future at the cost of the present. What we need to look for is paradise and not utopia. Technology will constantly promise a utopia in the future, since the days of Bacon, not since yesterday. Whereas what you need to do in order to enter the world of a poet like Rabindranath or a philosopher like Simone Weil or a poet like Goethe is to actually understand that paradise is right under your feet. Last thought, one of my favorite folk singers when I was in America was Joni Mitchell, who I think you might know. And she has this lovely song, right? Big Yellow Taxi. They pave paradise and make a parking lot. So how much can you improve the parking lot and get to paradise? You cannot do it that way. You will get to a utopia, which you will get restless with. Then you'll build another parking lot on top of the old one, and that's called progress. So we need to do something else. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Aseem. Rupert, last words to you.
Well, thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to pick up on what Aseem said there and end on a positive note, because my previous answer to the question was a little gloomy. If we really think beyond dystopia and utopia, then we have some kind of chance. And I do take some encouragement by the clear yearning in so much of the world for the kind of wisdom that is to be found in Buddhism and in most indigenous peoples and in the work of someone like Eckhart Tolle. And that wisdom has essentially to do with really inhabiting the present moment, and realizing that we have a paradise right now, and that we don't need the kind of Rawlsian or technocratic path to some alleged future better state. And as Aseem says, Wittgenstein was profoundly in tune with this. Also in his early philosophy, one of my favorite parts of the Tractatus is where Wittgenstein says, look, what possible good could be eternal life after death? What you need to understand is that eternity is available to you right now if you actually live in the present moment, and that timelessness is available in the present moment as an experience. I think that's beautiful and true. And I think there are some radical writers in the field of thinking of utopias and dystopias who understand this. One of them is Ursula Le Guin, for example, in her remarkable book, The Dispossessed, where she shows how utopia cannot be regarded as some kind of future state to be attained. It's something we have to make in the present all the time. We have to keep remaking it. And my colleague Samuel Alexander, with whom I did this little book, and Sam has a marvelous book called Entropia, which is a sort of an eco dystopia / utopia about living in the present in a way which can be sustained. And I want to recommend anyone here who's interested in what we've just been talking about to read Entropia. Yeah, so there you go. There's a positive note on which to end. If we really spend some serious part of our energy being serious about being here now, then actually that's probably the best way of all in which we can make it less likely that we destroy the future.
Thank you. It's a very controversial and beautiful way of ending. We would all like to jump on this and continue the debate, but our time is over for today. I have enjoyed so much, Rupert, Anat, Aseem. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to all attendees. Sorry for not being more dialogical this time, but with 4 panelists, what could we do? And with this technology, anyway, we've done what we could today. Thank you all, and I hope to continue the conversation for a long time still with you.